All right, so let's get rolling here. I want to first introduce our speaker. John Buchanan received his master's degree in humanistic and transpersonal psychology from the University of West Georgia, and then his doctorate from the Graduate Institute of Liberal Arts at Emory University in Atlanta. And that's where he first studied process thought. Process thought, as he may go into a little bit more information, is based on the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead. And so John studied there with William Beardsley at Emory, and then also with David Ray Griffin. And he's also a trained and certified holotropic breathwork practitioner. And so his new book is called Processing Reality, Finding Meaning in Death, Psychedelics, and Sobriety. And so we were very excited to be able to arrange for John to come be with us this evening and to share a little bit about his journey and about his book. So John will speak for a little bit, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. Take it away.
Thanks, Sherry. I appreciate being invited to this Process and Faith pop-up. As you mentioned, it's a nice sort of return to source, because Will Beardsley, who is I believe the founder of Process and Faith, was the person that introduced me to Alfred North Whitehead, and in particular in process philosophy and theology in general. I'd spent about 10 years in and out of college, dropping in and out, as it were. And by the time I got to Emory working my Ph.D., I was thinking about archetypal psychology, and I'd sort of wanted phenomenology, but that didn't quite work out for what I was thinking about. And my advisor said, Will Beardsley's retiring and going out to Claremont at the end of this semester. Why don't you take a directed study in process thought in Whitehead? So out of the blue, and I thought, okay. And that was really a life-changing event, because I'd been as a youngster, I was interested in science and a number of things. But when I was 19, I took some psychedelics, and it really made me wonder about everything, and sort of opened up so many questions. And so I was trying to find something that would incorporated science and mystical experience and fit into everyday life also. And for those of you who are not familiar with Whitehead, his goals of speculative philosophy are to account for all experience, and of primary importance is fusing science and religion into a unified metaphysical scheme. So I thought, that sounds right. Get these things somehow all, I can understand them all in some unified way, that I don't have to keep switching. I'm studying neurology, but now I'm studying mystical experience, and they aren't really connected directly. Also of great interest to me along the way was reading Stanislav Grof's work in transpersonal psychology. He'd done extensive work with psychedelics and psychiatric patients in Czechoslovakia, probably more applied psychotherapy with LSD than anyone else in the world has so far. And he came to the United States and was continuing that work until it was shut down in the late 60s, early 70s. But he wrote his Realms of the Human Unconscious, where he described a cartography of the depth psyche. And this was very interesting to me, because he came up with various sort of phenomenology of non-ordinary states, and which fit in, that came out of his work with psychedelic experiences. When I was early on in my psychedelic days, I had this experience, it's sort of an epiphany. I was walking across this in this apartment, and suddenly tripping, and I suddenly had this image of 3 overlapping circles, one of those diagrams they have where they have 3 areas, and it was philosophy, religion, and psychology. And in the middle, where they all overlapped, I felt like psychedelics open up an experiential access to how all of these are connected. And so that was really the impetus to start studying psychology and philosophy. I really spent a lot more time in psychology until I felt like that had lived, couldn't tell me everything I wanted to know, and then got into a lot of philosophy and some religion, and then finally stumbled upon Whitehead at Emory, thanks to my advisor. And as Sherry mentioned, I went out to Claremont, which was where John Cobb and David Griffin and the Center for Process Studies and Process and Faith was located, and took some courses there, and continued that as my dissertation, which was on Whitehead and psychology in general. Then for many years, I've been trying to figure out how to put what I think are some very valuable ideas that both process thought and transpersonal psychology have into a way that was accessible, because Whitehead's philosophy can be quite challenging, even for people who are fairly sophisticated in these areas. Grof, I think, is a lot more accessible, although if you haven't studied psychology, it'd be a little bit more challenging. But Whitehead in particular is difficult to get at. So after sort of trying to rewrite my dissertation and send it off to David Griffin to take a look at, and he said, I think you better start from scratch. So I started, thought, okay. I didn't quite do that, but almost. By the end of it, I'd rewritten just about everything. But at some point it occurred to me, since Whitehead's philosophy uses experience as the central reality, but in an interesting way. It's these momentary events that are characteristic, fundamental events that are characteristic of everything from quantum occasions through cellular activity, through molecular and human experience. So I thought, well, since he's using experience, maybe I should start off talking about my experiences that led me to be interested in these topics and the questions that were raised, and how I found Whitehead and transpersonal psychology so helpful for understanding these issues. And so I mentioned 5 pivotal events in my life as a way of introducing these ideas. The first was my father's quite sudden death when I was 11 years old. And, this raised a lot of at 11, I wasn't probably terribly coherent on this, but at an emotional level, it certainly raised a lot of existential questions, like around basic trust in life and about a loving God. William James has a wonderful way of putting it: is the universe friendly? And I think one of the reasons I related so much to the movie Marathon Man is the scene where the Nazi dentist is drilling Dustin Hoffman's teeth and keeps asking him, is it safe? Is it safe? And much to his chagrin, he doesn't know what he's even talking about. But I thought, yeah, that really captures that also. Is it safe? Now, Whitehead, what I found so valuable, or I found a lot, but in particular with this, Whitehead describes God as having an enveloping, loving presence that's always there to sort of as a loving companion, and also preserves all accomplishment. So both, there's a, you're surrounded by love, and there isn't the kinds of loss that we feel like, that things are saved in a way that's, I find, very soothing, should I say, reassuring. And there's a possibility of subjective immortality, although we don't think that we don't know what Whitehead really thought on that. But some Whiteheadians think their subjective immortality is a pretty good likelihood. David Griffin has a wonderful book called Parapsychology, Philosophy, and Spirituality that looks at the possibility of survival of death, which I recommend highly. What was helpful with Grof's work on this existential question was that, his cartography and description of the human psyche presents so many amazing possibilities with a vast array of spiritual dimensions and experiences that it's very exciting. That we aren't just sort of stuck here. We work and then we die. There's all these spiritual adventures to be had on top of all the more practical ones we're more familiar with. The second experience was getting into alcohol and drugs. Now that may sound funny, but it was revelatory to me that I could alter my consciousness this way. So, and it's like, I loved things about magic and science fiction and powers of the mind. I really felt like this was, so it's real, I can, and now unfortunately I liked it way too much, which got me into trouble down the line. But it was fascinating, and it really led to some epistemological questions about, what does it mean for ourselves in the world if taking certain substances can dramatically change our perception? So I looked into this, the epistemological issues with Whitehead. He has a fascinating metaphysical invention, so to speak, which is the prehension, which is a direct intuitive access to past events, to all past events. Now, this opens up a lot of doors in the transpersonal realm, but and within the human realm, or within the more personal, we have a direct access to memory, which is the kind of thing that Stan Grof talks about in his work with psychedelics and non-ordinary states. That there's a memory without a material substrate, he calls it. It's not that we're somehow checking in with a neural activity and accessing memory that way. We have direct. We directly reconnect with past events. In certain circumstances, I would give that a caveat. So Whitehead, presents this mode of access to the world and to other more obscure dimensions of reality. And Stan Grof's work explores what these dimensions and experiences might account for, or might reveal when we move outside the ordinary states of consciousness. My third experience was I'd taken some drugs, but I hadn't taken a powerful psychedelic. So taking LSD was sort of a new level of more of a metaphysical issue about what is reality. I don't know if anyone else ever listened to Fireside and Theater, which were these very interesting comedy albums from the late 60s that were way sort of psychedelically enhanced Monty Python or something, but they would have students in the audience when the principal was trying to give a speech yelling, "What is reality?" And I thought, well, that's right. Well, what is reality? Our mystical experience is real was it's still a topic of conversation, but that was a big thing back in the 60s and 70s. A big argument among religious scholars about whether, it's not real because it's psychedelically induced. And I think that's being sort of sorted out today, although I think I shouldn't probably even say that. But for Whitehead, as I mentioned, everything actual is made up of these occasions of experience, mostly unconscious. We're not saying that atoms or cells or molecules are conscious. We're saying that there's a synthetic activity of pulling together feelings from the past. So these events, mostly unconscious, are created by feeling the feelings of others, which is a nice, kind of way of thinking about the world in general. I'm constituted out of my feelings of, my body, but also of all the people I'm in relationship with is who I am, along with my creative contributions to that. I've mentioned Grof's cartography of the depth psyche, which he argues, I think, of course these experiences are real. I mean, you don't want to just say they're real because people have them, but a lot of them may be actually accessing entities that have existence in their own rights. Although, I think that's a huge question to be sorted out. The kinds of things people have on ayahuasca, these spirit entities or entities of the vine, and the animals that appear what kind of status to give them is a huge question to sort out, beyond me at this point, but a fascinating one, I think. So together, Whitehead and Grof offer a much richer, deeper, and more spiritual cosmology than was found in modern Western paradigm. Shortly thereafter, I went on to college and continued my descent into drug use and drinking, but I had one more particularly powerful experience with psychedelics, which I would say sort of opened the question of theological question, because I felt like I was encountering a very, very powerful presence that was an entity, not just a state of consciousness, not just sort of a Buddhist awareness, but something like God was lurking out there. I won't say I was immersed in God, but I felt like I got close enough to wonder what that was all about. So Whitehead has a very interesting approach to religion. First of all, it's a panentheism, where God and world are in constant interaction, which I think is wonderful. This was where William James was struggling to articulate in his last works in a pluralistic universe. He's very opposed to the idea of an absolute, an all-encompassing absolute that negated the reality of the individual, so to speak, of our own moments of experience. He felt that this was sort of a horrific picture in a way, and that that both are important, a God and the world. And Whitehead has a very nice way of describing an interaction, a flow of feeling and experience back and forth between all events and entities, and this encompassing presence which feels and then returns feeling to the world. So God's presence is accessible, which makes mystical experiences possible, and as well as God providing direction if we can be open to it. Whitehead also talks about a dual nature, although there's an abstraction about God as a infinite reservoir of potential, and also as a conscious integration of the universe. And interestingly, Stan Grof has 3 categories that he describes as the ultimate experiences that people have on psychedelics. And one of them is the supercosmic void, or the metacosmic void, which as he describes it in his book, sounds strikingly similar to what Whitehead calls the primordial nature of God, this reservoir of pure potential. And the universal mind is one of the other experiences, which sounds very close to what Whitehead's description of the consequent nature of God. My last important event was getting sober. After a series of attempts, that's how I ended up out in Claremont to study with David Griffin. The semester after I went to studied with Will Beardsley and Whitehead, things finally got bad enough again that I went out and went to the Betty Ford Center. And after a while, I thought, Claremont's just an hour and 45 minutes away. I could go over there and take some classes, and ended up taking class with Whitehead with David Griffin, who's the co-author of the revised version of Process and Reality. So he knows that material really well. And John Hick, who was a British theologian, which was a fascinating class on para-eschatology, which I didn't even know what that meant, but it means, what happens after we die, but before some ultimate union with God? Is there something in between there? And that turned out to be a great class. And I also took an exceptional experience in William James directed study with David Griffin. So I was very, very fortunate. And also somewhere along the lines there, I thought, I think Stan Grof is up at Esalen, isn't he? So I drove up there and did a couple workshops with him, and they mentioned they were starting a 3-year training group. So I signed up for that, and that was a marvelous experience to spend that kind of time with Stan and Christine in immersive, almost 2-week immersions in doing holotropic breath work and learning about their theories and developing some great friendships there. And then I went back to working on my dissertation and book, and but the crisis around, I guess, around getting sober, besides the fact of doing it, was well, what is so what's my life going to be now? What's a meaning and a purpose in my life? And one of the things I love with Whitehead is he talks about he's got a book called The Adventure of Ideas, but that's also what life is about. It's an adventure. He says somewhere that not to aim at happiness. If you try to have happiness, you end up with the bastard substitute anesthesia. Happiness is the occasional byproduct of a life lived with adventure. And so, I like that. And the creation of beauty he speaks of as part of the purpose of life. Community is very central to his thinking. These interacting events create more and more complex communities and organisms, as it were. So contributing to the world and to God. And he also talks about God's purpose is intensity of experience, creating, he's created more and more complex entities to have richer, you could say richer experience also, and deeper experience. So it occurred to me recently, in a way, psychedelics could be considered a religious sacrament in that way. I think they intensify experience and deepen it and enrichen it. With Grof's work on this, the breath work and the psychedelics are ways of get deep healing to help release our deeper potentials, and with the idea that spiritual insight and experience leads to spiritual action and to a spiritual life. So together, I think their ideas offer the basis for a new cosmological vision, one that I think is deeper and more powerful than what has so far been formulated by Thomas Berry and Brian Swim in the New Story or the Great Work. I just read Brian Swim's Cosmogenesis book, which is quite good. And I learned a lot about Thomas Berry. So I wish I'd met him. Sounds like a wonderful man. But I like the additional spiritual depth and a richer cosmological view I think you get with Whitehead and Grof. And one of my favorite books are by the philosopher, psychologist, science fiction writer, Olaf Stapledon, who wrote back in the 1920s and 1930s. And I think he felt like his ideas weren't being sold very well through psychology and philosophy. So he wrote some incredible science fiction, one of which is called Star Maker. And in the prelude, they refer to it as a myth for our times. And it's inspired by Whitehead, as well as Marx, with community and the importance of community. So I recommend it's an unusual read because there really aren't any characters in it. It's this one man sort of astral projects off into the universe and discovers what the universe, other beings, communities, compound entities, and discovers the ultimate purpose of the universe, as it were, and all universes. So it's a powerful read. I like to point out that John Lilly, who is one of the most interesting and intrepid explorers of non-ordinary states, he was the one that worked with dolphins to see if he could communicate with them, invented the sensory deprivation tank. And on the back of the Star Maker's 50th anniversary edition, he says, Star Maker is the only book I know of that can account for everything that I have experienced. So he experienced a lot. So quick summary. Whitehead provides a intellectual foundation, but one centered on experience, and his aims to account for all experience must be taken into account. and it's, by experience. Once again, he's referring to mostly unconscious, a synthetic activity, a creative synthetic activity of pulling past feelings into a new burst of feeling, as it were. One of the great things is David Griffin has written about is he has a process naturalism, which is much deeper and broader than the kind of scientific naturalism that you run into, which, the only thing that's real is the physical world that we can see, which eliminates a lot of our experience in reality. So his is a much broader naturalism, but one that, that he was also, he was a Whitehead was a mathematical physicist who had his own theory of relativity because he thought Einstein's metaphysical assumptions were wrong or were misguided. And he was around when quantum theory was being formed. So his philosophy was taking into account the major scientific breakthroughs that we're still dealing with today. With Grof, his cartography of non-ordinary experience, I think, is incredibly important. And he also has his depth psychology, unifies the insights of Freud, Wilhelm Reich, Otto Rank, and Jung in a very, very helpful way, and has an interesting take on psychopathology, where symptoms are the attempt of the body to heal itself. So instead of trying to suppress symptoms, you want to magnify symptoms to bring out the underlying energies and experiences that are repressed and causing the damage, which is what he discovered happens with psychedelics and what he developed holotropic breathwork to help with. I had some stuff about that I thought was interesting about mystery schools and a few other new ideas, but why don't I take a break and let that settle in and see if I've stimulated any thoughts in this wonderful audience. Thank you for showing up. I appreciate it.